I would put music and some audio cues in this intro, but I don't have any. Sorry. If you're a casual anime fan who came into this video expecting some sort of recommendation into the Fate franchise, then it should be disappointing that it isn't. Because the fact that I can't personally give you a definitive recommendation on where to begin is the reason behind this video. Sometime back in October, my older sister came and visited me and my dad at our apartment. It was a fairly casual visit, I suppose. She'd stay for a day or two and we did some stuff, nothing special there. Since my sister is a casual anime fan, I showed her my anime on our TV and I randomly mentioned the Fate series. She asked what it's about, and being the avid anime fan that I am, I went and tried to recommend the series, only I couldn't. In fact, when trying to recommend a starting point, I was at a loss for words. Keep in mind that I'm already entrenched in the anime sphere and got into Fate naturally because of it. My sister, being the quote-unquote normie that she is, isn't like that. She watches anime that may sound interesting, and when she has the time for it. From there, failing to recommend any of the Fate shows, I promptly thought about why. The question is simple. How do you begin Fate when you're a casual? And when starting to answer this question, I came to a number of conclusions, none of which are really conclusive. The easiest answer Fate fans tend to go for is read the visual novel, and I can understand the thinking behind it. Simply put, the visual novel, regardless of its flaws, really is Fate Stay Night in its purest form, or naughtiest form if you're playing the original 2004 release with its totally tasteful content. Fate has always had a hit or miss track record with adaptations. Recommending the visual novel may seem like the obvious entry point into the series, but it doesn't hold much water when the person you're talking to has no interest in visual novels whatsoever. More so with something like Fate Stay Night. Fate Stay Night is a long visual novel with a word count of about 800,000 words in total when accounting for its 3 story routes, with Heaven's Feel being the absolute longest. So much so that there hasn't been an anime adaptation of it up to now, with uFotable finally making one as a film trilogy. Simply put, unless the person you're trying to introduce the Fate series to is a glutton for words and a mountain of exposition, all delivered with fan translation jobs with questionable prose, recommending the visual novel just isn't a great way for a casual to get into Fate. Of course, there's always the anime adaptations, and while I said they could be hit or miss, screw it. A casual won't care, hell, they won't even know about any changes or omissions they may take. But even here, this is where I stumble into problems. Excluding the numerous spin-offs, the main branch of the Fate series currently has 4 mainline anime adaptations: Studio Deen's Fate 2006, Studio Deen's Unlimited Blade Works, Fate Zero, and uFotable's Unlimited Blade Works TV series. I'd like to recommend at least one of these as a definitive starting point for casuals, but I wouldn't be making this video if I could do so easily. But I can't. As I thought about it, I came to find that each adaptation seemed to have different problems in terms of being able to be easily approached by those who aren't willing to put in the time to take all the essentials in. Fate 2006 is probably the worst adaptation of Fate Stay Night, even if I think it's still a decent anime in its own right. Studio Deen took a really odd choice with Fate 2006. Instead of choosing one of the 3 story routes and sticking to it, they decided to mix elements from all 3 routes together like Lego blocks and add original elements for good measure. It uses the Fate route as a base template, but as you're going through it, suddenly events belonging to Unlimited Blade Works will pop up, thrown and connected into the mix, and the Heaven's Feel elements are probably the weirdest addition. Actually, to say they mixed Heaven's Feel isn't exactly accurate. It's less that Studio Deen took elements from Heaven's Feel as much as they simply took the basic setup and did their own thing with it. This anime tinkers so much with its source that it's amazing it manages to be as comprehensive incomprehensible as it is, the result is an anime I label as a bizarro adaptation. An adaptation transformed into a freaking fucked hodgepodge. Instead of focusing on the fate route only and shortening the length when need be, you have external elements that don't belong along with stuff Studio Deen made themselves, and while I like it for what it isn't the best way to get into Fate. A casual anime fan will get the gist of the story, the primary themes of the Fate route, and may even get invested, but they aren't getting a faithful adaptation here. I can't recommend Fate 2006 wholeheartedly, though to say it's the worst adaptation isn't really saying much. If Fate 2006 is the worst adaptation, Deen's Unlimited Blade Works isn't too far behind, but for a different reason. Where its precursor's a bad adaptation because it adds and changed too much, Deen's Blade Works is a bad adaptation because of how much it cuts, and in turn, actually makes for an inferior story compared to its predecessor. Deen's Blade Works is a bare-bones adaptation, a skeleton missing half its flesh. In a brain fart of a decision I can only assume was thought up by bath salt huffing gerbils, it decides to tell the Unlimited Blade Works story within under 2 hours, easily the biggest detriment this film faces with the material. The end result? A film where the story beats constantly jump from one point to another without the necessary time for build-up, characters who have their arcs sliced down by a dramatic degree thanks to cut story content, themes lacking exploration which makes the entire thing feel more like a string of ideas than a whole work with meaning, and overall, you're not getting the true Unlimited Blade Works story with this film. As said in my review, it's like having a book read to you at a very fast rate, with numerous paragraphs being skipped at regular intervals. If a casual anime fan is looking at this as a starting point to get into Fate, I don't recommend it for this reason. Of course, you might be going, but Hollow! Studio Deen's Fate adaptations suck ass! uFotable is the way to go. And at a glance, I agree. As adaptations go, uFotable has handled the Fate series with a noticeable degree of care, with the intention of telling as much story as possible while looking top-notch. Fate Zero is among my favorites, and though I have problems with it, their Unlimited Blade Works TV series is a gigantic upgrade from Deen's Blade Works. Even then, I can't say they are perfect starting points for casual anime viewers. I'm aware that plenty of current Fate fans have probably gotten their introduction from Fate Zero alone back in the day, and new fans might have used uFotable's Blade Works as a starting point, but coming from the perspective of someone who's become acquainted with the series in intervening years since I was introduced to the series back in 2011, recommending Zero to a casual now doesn't feel right. Same goes with Blade Works, because the problems Zero and uFotable's Blade Works face are more or less intertwined. It's obvious the original 2004 Fate Stay Night wasn't really made with a fully fleshed out prequel in mind to begin with, as evident by the fact that the Fate Zero light novel was written by a completely different writer. So when it came time to follow up Fate Zero with Unlimited Blade Works, uFotable made the attempt to retool the story as a pseudo-sequel of sorts. This made it so that things that were originally twists meant to be standalone for Fate Stay Night, or were meant to be exclusive to the Unlimited Blade Works storyline in particular, are now simply continuations from the anime before it. This means, if you watch one instead of the other, you'll literally spoil certain elements meant to be twists in one another. The true nature of Kirei's character is spoiled if you watch Zero, but is supposed to be a general twist in Fate Stay Night. The true relations between Rin and Sakura? Also spoiled in Fate Zero. You aren't supposed to know their true relations until the Heavens Feel route. Same goes with the relations of parentage between Ilia and Shiro. The true nature of the Holy Grail? Spoiled to the bone in Fate Zero and Unlimited Blade Works should you choose to begin with one or the other. Admittedly, these things are concentrated on the intentions rather than how a casual could enjoy something, but from a certain point of view, isn't this important in its own way? It'd be like being introduced to Star Wars with the prequels, following Hayden Christensen around with how much he hates sand and how it gets everywhere, and see him become Darth Vader, but then fire up the original trilogy, get to Empire Strikes Back, watch the iconic "I am your father" scene, and go, well yeah, He's Luke's father. I know because I heard him say how he doesn't like sand and saw him force choke Padme to death. The intention is ruined. How do I know this? Because that's what happened to me when I saw Empire Strikes Back as a kid. The reverse can happen too. You see Darth Vader as this intimidating, ruthlessly evil badass with his character arc that spans throughout the original trilogy, ultimately redeeming himself in the eyes of Luke and the viewers. Then fire up the prequels and see Kid Anakin doing Kid Anakin things, and hear him say how he doesn't like sand and how it gets everywhere. It clouds your original impressions. You just can't seem to win. So with all this said, what's the best way for a casual anime fan to get into the Fate series? Fate Stay Night is more expansive than one may think going in. The Fate franchise isn't entirely self-contained. It's a series with so much detail and lore that it makes for pages upon pages of wiki information, some of which are even connected to other Type Moon properties like Tsukihime, Karu no Kyokai, and so on. It has a sequel that's questionable in terms of how it's even a sequel, a bunch of spin-offs in anime, video game, light novel, and manga forms, including Fate Extra and the Fate Collide series, which provides even more pages full of more backstories and more concepts, some of which can be made into entirely new Fate content in of themselves. There are plenty of ways to get into Fate Stay Night, maybe too many. It's not like choosing the books or the Peter Jackson film trilogy if you want to get into Lord of the Rings. Frankly, there is no ideal way to enter the Fate series. You simply pick one and hope what you see will get you hooked. Fate Zero is often pointed at since it's a prequel, it's uFotable, and it's recent enough so that it isn't considered an old anime just yet and is self-contained enough so that it can be seen on its own, but others will point to uFotable's Bladeworks because it's the most recent. Some fans of Deen's Fate adaptations will point to Fate 2006. Some will tell you to simply ignore the main branch and go towards the spin-offs, like the fun but raunchy Fate Collide series, or simply tell you the visual novel is the true way to go. But if you ask me, the question shouldn't be which Fate anime adaptation is best fit for a casual to start with, but rather what could have been best fitted for a casual to start with. When uFotable announced that Unlimited Bladeworks was chosen to be the follow-up to Fate Zero, I was disappointed, not only because I knew Saber was going to get the shaft as far as character development was concerned, and I could go on a tangent about how uFotable handled her in the anime itself, but it also robbed it of defined approachability. Of the three routes in Fate Stay Night, the Fate route is considered the weakest for how simple and bland it is compared to the others, but wouldn't that be good enough for a random casual anime fan to go in with? Fate 2006 tried its hand at adapting Fate. It ended up messing around too much and made a bad adaptation, but how about a straight up adaptation of the Fate route, but with the action direction and visual presentation uFotable is famous for? I also think the Fate route could have been more natural in terms of being a Fate Zero follow-up. Since Saber is the main heroine, she makes for a strong connection to prequel events, especially when it comes to Kiritsugu, whom she resents because of the climax in Fate Zero. Her arc from that story could have been continued where it left off in a more natural fashion, instead of uFotable hitting the reset button and having Saber's character be almost entirely different in their Unlimited Bladeworks adaptation, with little to no signs of how Kiritsugu affected her. Plus, since the Fate route is the most straightforward story, it also means it doesn't have to rely on the lore to the same extent that Unlimited Bladeworks or Heaven's Feel do, which could very well make it more prime for a Fate beginner. Because the setup for Fate Stay Night is essentially this. Magic exists. There's the Holy Grail. The Grail can grant seemingly any wish. People summon superhuman servants from mythology and history to fight for the Grail. A teenage boy with a hero complex who can use a little bit of magic gets roped into it by happenstance. He summons his powerful Saber-class servant. He gets help from a gifted Magus, who also happens to be a fellow student at his school. He fights to end the Grail War. That's the setup in a nutshell, and the Fate route is the route that complicates this setup the least. There's no heavy element of parallel universes, no explicitly revealed backstory from characters who aren't a part of the main cast, there are no crest worms, there isn't as much important pieces of lore that the viewer must be told in order for stuff to make any lick of sense that can't simply be explained with, because magic, yo. It's the most basic, it's the least convoluted, it's definitely the least challenging challenging in terms of themes and ideas compared to the other routes, and it just might be the best option to make an adaptation aimed at those unfamiliar with the franchise. I'm not saying I'm totally right with this video. The intention wasn't to say that this or this must happen in order to have a good entry point for casual anime fans. Anyone who wants to get into Fate can ultimately do it however they like. What I've said are simply suggestions because there isn't really that one good way for a casual anime fan to enter the Fate series and not only come out of it with a good understanding of why it has the following it has after all these years, but also to get a good adaptation that's representative of the material at hand and not a hodgepodge like Fate 2006. Because with so many ways for a casual to enter the Fate series, which one is really ideal? Attack on Titan got a lot of its surprisingly enthusiastic fan base with a TV anime rather than the manga, that one spin-off, or those shitty live-action films. Plenty of Naruto fans got into the series through the anime well before exposing themselves to the manga, films, and video games. Even with a franchise like Gundam, a franchise that has been going on since 1979 and has TV series, films, manga, and spin-offs up the wazoo, if you ask around, you'll still get an answer or two that may well turn out to be good starting points for a casual curious in getting into Gundam. I can't seem to do exactly that for Fate Stay Night, as any suggestion I could make has flaws. Whether it be a large visual novel that requires boatloads of reading, two bad adaptations, two adaptations that have a conundrum where watching one will spoil the surprises and twists of the other, spin-offs that aren't representative of what the franchise is really about, or Carnival Phantasm, which is the worst case scenario, because you must be a fan of Type Moon in order to understand a lot of the jokes. As a fan who's enthusiastic about the Fate franchise, I wish there was a definitive casual starting point for anyone interested in Fate or Type Moon as a whole, or at the very least, a swift, confident answer to such a surprisingly complicated question.